Good morning, church. It's really good to be with you this morning, seeing some faces that I've known around the denomination for many, many years, and several of you that I've met over the last year as I've been here a couple of times doing the change cycle, and I'm just really blessed to be here with and among you this morning. Let's go to God in prayer. God, I just ask that your Spirit continue to move amongst us. We feel your presence. We know you're here. And I ask now, God, that I be moved aside, but I only be the vessel, that the words of my mouth are those that you share. In your many names we pray. Amen. There's a man named John that got a parrot. Had a new parrot. He'd had parrots before, but this particular parrot had a little problem with his language. And he did everything he could to try to change that. He spent a lot of time talking very softly and very gently with his parrot. He played a lot of soft music, played a lot of Christian music, and the parrot just wouldn't change. And one day he got so frustrated, he took the parrot and he just shook him. The parrot just continued to use a lot of profanity, and it was really embarrassment to John. So having finally had enough, he thought, I'll just cool him down. He put him in the freezer. And he closed the door of the freezer, and he heard a little squawking going on for a while, and all of a sudden, after about a minute, that got very quiet. Well, John began to feel really guilty. He was afraid, oh no, I've left him in there too long. I've let him die. And he opens it, and the parrot very calmly straightens his feathers up and says, I'm very sorry, John. I realize that I have probably not been the best parrot, and my language has not been very good, and I promise you from this day forward that will not be the case anymore. Well, John's feeling pretty good about himself, and he's thinking, well, maybe it worked. A couple minutes later, the parrot looked up at him and said, John, can I ask you a question? John said, sure. What did the chicken do? I think when we look at the psalm this morning, I can just kind of see God sometimes just shaking God's head, thinking, what is it going to take? I had these Israelites wandering around through the wilderness for 40 years, and I continue to do miracle after miracle. They never went without their basic needs. Yet, they continue to frustrate. And God just kind of reaches a point that it's like, what is it going to take? How are they going to ever get to the point of fully trusting? And the psalmist ends by saying, God just kind of gets frustrated enough to say they'll never get where they're going because they keep staying in the way. Do we do that today? Do we let ourselves get in the way of getting where God has for us? The only limitations on the gifts and the blessings that God has for us are the limitations that we put on it. The problem is, too many times, I think we begin to think that we're only worth so much. Or we begin to think that maybe we know the best way to get there. Or maybe we're feeling pretty good about, where we're at and everything's going all right, and we think we can have a little bit more control and we can have a little bit more charge of the situation, and we stop trusting. Or maybe we just take it for granted and think, maybe God's there for when I've got that major issue in my life, but I can handle this day-to-day stuff. I know in my life, that's when I find myself in the most trouble. When I get so complacent that I begin to think, I got this. I can walk through this. And God has to reach down and shake me every now and then. Maybe I need to be put in the freezer. Maybe I need to be reminded and I need to look around and wonder what happened to that chicken. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, I think is the whole book of Ephesians, Paul, I think, is at his most exuberant, talking about the lavishness of God's love and His grace, talking about the abundant life, talking about the joy and the freedom, and there's so much excitement. And Paul was like that in many of his writings, that even at times when he was in prison, nothing could stand in the way of the faith that he had developed, and looking to the message that Jesus had. But I find it peculiar when I really dig in and look and prayed about it and looked at that story that was in Ephesians today, in that particular part of the letter that Paul was writing to the church of Ephesus. That church could have been an MCC. That church was made up of a group of people that were really not a lot alike in many ways. They were really defying a lot of what was happening in society at that time. The church made up of Jews and Gentiles. Very different people, very different customs. Yet, God had a special calling on that church. God had a special calling on that group of people. A calling that they would be in harmony with each other. That they would sit at the table and eat together, although their customs forbid it. That they would break down those barriers. They would reach out their arms. They would stretch the limits. And they would be the group that God called them into special ministry. To show the world that we can be different and be united in God's love. Paul says in that passage that he prays continuously for them. When I first read that, I just kind of read through it and I thought, okay, continuous prayer, that must be the message here. That's what we're supposed to talk about. But I began to think a little deeper. And I wonder if Paul was emphasizing there the importance of that continuous prayer because he was concerned that group of believers was going to become complacent. That group of believers was not staying relevant in where they needed to be. It's kind of like Thanksgiving coming up. We can gather all our family together, and those first few hours are pretty glorious and free. And oftentimes, as that day wears on, or as the weekend wears on, if they've come and stayed for the weekend, the tensions begin to rise a little bit. It may become a little uncomfortable. It may be like fish. After 3 days, it's time to go. I think Paul may have been warning in a way about those prayers. Warning that things could change. And being in prayer constantly, that they would remember that special call that God has on them. That they would remember that they were called to be a group of very different people that could find a unity, that could find a place together to pull together, regardless of the distractions that may be around them, regardless of the challenges that they may be facing, that God had promised, just as God promised each of us, an amazing and joyous and prosperous way. A lot of hope, a lot of opportunity, as long as we kind of stay out of the way. As we're willing to give our lives each and every day to that calling that God has on us. Sometimes that's an uncomfortable place to be. Sometimes it means we stretch beyond what it is we think that we're best at. Sometimes it means that we take on tasks that we're really not comfortable with. When I was growing up, I played basketball and ran track, and I remember a coach one time reminding me as I was running those bleachers, because I had missed a few free throws. And I was running those bleachers, and I was running those bleachers, that it's only through that pain that I would gain. It's only through those challenges that I would become better. We're called through those challenges. I won't ask you to raise your hands because it could be embarrassing to some, but are there any Amazing Race fans here? Good. The current season of Amazing Race, which of course was filmed last year, has an amazing person on it. Bethany is her name. If you saw the movie back in 2011 called Soul Surfer, Bethany was a surfer, is a surfer, continues to be a surfer today. When she was 13 years old, she was at the peak, rising quickly in the surfing world, and was beginning to hit the international stage and was becoming known as one of the women to beat in the surfing competitions professionally. And one morning, she was out for an early morning surfing practice with her best friend and her father. It was about 7:30 in the morning, and she was laying on her surfboard, paddling out, and a large shark came up and took her arm and a chunk of her surfboard. Her father and her friend got her back to shore and got her to the hospital. Bethany was determined to not let that obstacle stop her from her dream of being a champion. To not let that obstacle get in the way of doing what she knew was an opportunity for her. 3 weeks later, she was back on her surfboard. 4 months later, she finished 5th in a professional surfing competition. If you saw the movie, her faith had an amazing part of that story. As I watch her on The Amazing Race right now, she's outdoing so many fully, ably bodied people. The episode this past week, they had to rappel down 20 stories. There's not a challenge that she gets faced with that she's not willing to go for. She's adapted different parts of her body to make up for the appendage that's missing. Her feet can do amazing things. But she rappelled down this 20-story rope faster than the men around her. She swam faster than those around her. She started behind people and passed them and got to the clue and got back. If she can do it with her faith, what stands in the way of us? I believe this morning, church, we're challenged to look at obstacles that come up in our life. And just like the parrot, we're challenged to look at our attitude, to look at what it is that might be standing between us and the glorious and abundance that God promises to us. I know for me, most of the time, that biggest challenge is me. That biggest challenge is me standing in the way. Is my faith not great enough? Or is my arrogance too great? Am I too tied to a clique? Am I too convinced that I know what needs to happen? Am I looking for the attention? Am I sticking my nose in where it doesn't need to be stuck? Or am I willing to rest in God's arms? Am I willing to be on my knees and open my day each and every day saying, not my will but yours? Am I willing to stop in the middle of the day and say, I'm yours? Or do I think I need to be in control? It's through our faithfulness in that change that God is able to work. MCC as a whole has gone through changes. This church is going through a change. Our church is going through a change. I believe that we go through changes because God is opening new and fresh doors for us. We become pretty comfortable sitting in our pews. We get pretty comfortable with the same people coming through the doors. But what are we doing to be as Jesus would be? Are our lives open? Are our attitudes open? Are we willing to make the changes today to continue to be relevant? Are we willing to make our homes, our church homes, a welcoming and inviting place, even if it means that it may not be exactly what we want? Or are we looking to be comfortable? Church, I believe today God is challenging us to stretch our wings. God is challenging us to open our arms. And maybe more importantly, to open our ears. God is calling us as a denomination to reach out more globally than we've ever reached before. To look in different ways. But I also believe that God is calling each of us in our local churches to do the same. Church today is not like church was 25 years ago when I joined MCC. The people that are out there today are not looking and interpreting church in the same way that we interpreted it 25 years ago. You know, we come into MCC, many of us from a variety of different denominations, and we're real quick to say we're recovering Catholics, we're recovering Baptists, we're recovering Methodists, we're recovering whatever. But then we want the service to look just like our Baptist service or just like our Catholic service because we want to be that comfortable. I believe today, church, God is calling us to be uncomfortable. God is calling us today to make the changes that we need to make. Because church don't look the same as it did. There was a Buddhist that walked up to a hot dog vendor and said, "Give me one with everything on it." And he gave the vendor $20. And he stood there for a moment and he finally said, "Where's my change?" And the vendor looked at the Buddhist and said, "Change comes from within." Comes from within. Church, change comes from within each of us. And this morning, I believe, God is calling on us to open our lives to that change. To be faithful and trusting and knowing God will carry us through. Whatever our differences may be, whatever our likenesses may be, however uncomfortable we are needing to be, we need to be reminded that the glorious and joyful world that God has for us is provided. All we have to do is receive and stay in that will. God bless you this morning.